The football boot is one of the most important pieces of equipment the player can have in increasing their performance in the game. Lots of time, energy, and resources have been poured into research, marketing, and testing by these major companies to not only get an edge on their competition, but allowing the player to get an edge on their opponent. Throughout the years of football boot technology, football boots went from looking like this to different styles of boots that are catered to a specific playing ground and situation. As a biomechanics graduate student and former NCAA soccer player in the United States, I've been interested in learning about these boots in terms of performance and injury prevention. I've been digging through research-style articles for a while now. I have found 3 main takeaways from empirical research, and I can't wait to tell you what I found because some of it honestly surprised me. But first, we really got to talk about the different styles of boots. Of all the football boots in the world right now, they can generally be classified into 5 different types of boots. The first is your turf shoe. You primarily want to use these on artificial fields, such as turf. They have the highest number of studs, but the smallest style of studs, generally made in rubber. Next is your artificial grass shoe. These are also specifically catered for an artificial field, such as turf, but they have a different stud formation, mostly made in plastic studs and can be either conical or bladed. Next is your firm ground shoe. These are generally used in your natural grass in good conditions. They have plastic studs that can either be conical or bladed in shape. Next is the hard ground boots. These are catered for hard, natural, or dirt fields. They're made out of plastic studs and can either have conical or bladed or both style of stud. And finally is your soft ground boots. These are specifically catered for natural fields, specifically muddy or slippery conditions. These are generally characterized by a rigid plastic sole plate and only about 6 aluminum studs. Now that we know the different types of boots, I want to get this out of the way first and state the obvious here. All these boots have been specifically catered for the condition that they are best suited in. Therefore, ultimately, the condition that they're best suited in is generally going to be the specific situation or the specific playing ground that they were made for. I mean, these have been tested, they've been researched so heavily that something like this video doesn't have the capability of doing. However, what this video is for, not only for entertainment of just reading some cool research and presenting it on YouTube, but it's also for if you don't have the luxury of buying 5 different boots, 5 different styles of boots for 5 different playing conditions. If you only have enough money for one style of boot, what's going to be the best bang for your buck in terms of 5 different playing conditions? That's what this research is kind of looking at, and that's the question that I'm trying to answer today. Now, first, we're going to be talking about how these shoes line up on turf, both in performance and injury prevention. Now, what do I mean by performance? Well, it's either the speed of somebody running, cutting, or dribbling, right? That's normally the 3 different aspects that these research studies have used. In terms of performance, the soft ground was the worst. This model seemed unable to really fully penetrate the turf, causing slipperiness to occur and just less traction, which showed in being one of the lowest to perform in terms of the performance metrics. Surprisingly, the turf model also wasn't very good for performance, both on dry and wet conditions for turf. These turf shoes just did not show to be that great. The boots were reported to be slippery and not as much traction and definitely slower in terms of performance, especially compared to the firm ground and the artificial grass boots. While the best type of performance on turf was generally some sort of bladed style cleat, aspects of the firm ground cleat really showed to be one of the best in terms of performance metrics. In terms of injury risk, the turf shoe actually surprisingly showed to be one of the best for preventing injuries. The reason why the turf shoe is one of the most favorable in terms of injury prevention on artificial grass in terms of the other 4 styles of boots is because the turf shoe is so much different than the other 4 boots. Now, what do I mean by this? Just look at the outsole of the turf shoe compared to the other 4. It's the only one that's 1, made out of rubber, 2, has the smallest stud type, and 3, has the most amount of studs. And 4, what I would argue is that this is the boot that looks most similar to your normal tennis shoe, the normal shoes that you'd be wearing on a day-to-day basis. Why would you want to have your football shoe looking more and more like a normal tennis shoe? Now, this is due to a concept of the pressure location put on the foot during walking, running, or cutting. In a normal gait, aka a walk or a run, the pressure of the foot goes from the heel all the way up to about the big toe or the first metatarsal. This is how our feet are normally distributing our weight and putting the pressure on our foot. In terms of most football boots though, the opposite is true. The pressure starts at the heel and then goes towards the outside, the more lateral part of the foot, aka the fourth or fifth metatarsal, aka the pinky toe. Doing this just one time is no big deal, right? You do it all the time. There's variability in our movements. We're not robotic. But over time, that's going to lead to chronic foot injuries. The turf shoe doesn't show this, while the other four do. I would argue also that most rounded stud types do as well, but that's not really the topic of discussion for this video. But in every other sense, the turf shoe really isn't that good, not only for performance, but like we said, there's some slipperiness involved for this turf shoe, right? This slipperiness, aka this foot ground traction, has been shown to be correlated with the amount of forces or the amount of load put on the ankle, shown here in this graph. As you can see, the less traction that the foot and the ground have together, the higher the ankle load is, while the more traction that you have, the less load that is put on the ankle. Now, this slipperiness is just one aspect of injury prevention. The other way is potentially too much traction, which my entire last video talks about. So if you're interested in that, make sure you click up here somewhere. I don't really know where it's going to be, but if you're interested, you'll find it, right? You'll find it. On the contrary, shoes like the firm ground or the artificial grass, in terms of artificial turf, they show good amounts of traction, which in comparison to the traction ankle graphic, we can see that there's less ankle load that gets put on your body, on the ankle, when you're wearing these types of shoes, when you're having more traction on artificial turf. Welcome outside. It's really cold. Let's make this quick because I want to be inside. For natural grass performance, really any bladed stud is going to be your best bet for dry, ice, or even snowy conditions. This is because there's an ample amount of traction that occurs within these types of studs, primarily the firm ground and the hard ground style boots, but not for specifically the soft ground. There was one study in particular that looked at performance in terms of those three style of boots and found that the firm ground and the hard ground didn't really have significant differences in terms of performance. They were both high, but significantly lower than them was the soft, particularly in running. What was interesting though is that in the perception of these boots, in terms of the participants that were in the study, the hard ground boots were actually the ones that participants thought that they were the fastest in. All right, so now we're gonna get to injury prevention, and this is where things get a little interesting. One study in particular looked at this injury prevention in terms of natural grass and found that turf shoes were the best at reducing injuries on natural grass. Well, this is kind of factual in terms of the same reason for the artificial grass or the turf, right? That turf shoe does what the other types of shoes don't, which is that pressure location throughout the normal walking or running pattern. That's not going to change on natural grass. I mean, it didn't change on turf, so natural grass wouldn't be any different. What this study did show though was that there was a decrease in ground reaction force for turf shoes versus the other types of shoes, particularly soft ground shoes. Now, this would be interesting because ground reaction force is the amount of force that you put into the ground. And because of Newton's third law, that is the amount of force that comes back on you. So each force has an equal and opposite reaction force, right? So with turf shoes having the least amount of ground reaction force, that means that there isn't as much force coming up onto the body, therefore eliciting that there isn't going to be as much of susceptibility of injuries. Now, there is a little caveat with this study, right? The study only had 6 participants involved in it, which leads to some power issues. Power that is, developing what's called type 1 and type 2 errors, not having enough participants in a given study to basically say, yes, this is how the general population is going to be perceived. 6 participants is pretty small in terms of that, so there is maybe a little asterisk in this study, but even more so in terms of other studies that have looked at the differences in these shoes. Turf shoes showed that they were the slowest in terms of running speed, right? Now, why does this matter? Well, if you run the slowest with one pair of shoes, but all the other pairs of shoes that you wear, all the different types, you run so much faster, well, that's going to change the amount of force that you're putting into the ground, right? So therefore, that's maybe one of the reasons why the turf shoe elicited so much lower ground reaction force. It's not because the distribution of the load is a lot better. It could just be because the participants didn't feel comfortable enough, either through being too slippery or what have you, so they didn't run as fast. Regardless of that study, there was a different study that looked at kinematic and kinetic variables between different styles of boots, and they found that the turf shoe had no significant differences, that is, to the firm ground or the hard ground boot. This is to say, in a more holistic viewpoint of injury prevention, that turf shoes may be less susceptible to injury, but some other studies show that firm ground shoes as well as hard ground shoes might not be too much difference. There might not be too much difference there in terms of the kinetic and the kinematic variables. You still have to consider the lateral pressure location, but besides that, is there much of a difference between those three? I don't really think so. Goodbye now. I'm going back inside where it's warm. So even though generally speaking, the playing ground that each boot is specifically catered for is probably going to be the generalized best option for you, for sake of, if you don't live in luxury and can't buy 5 boots, this is what we found. A lot of studies found that the turf shoe was considered the protective model of the 5 types of shoes, in that for injury prevention, it is the least susceptible. That being said, in the natural grass, the turf shoe, hard ground, and firm ground didn't really show much kinetic or kinematic differences in terms of injury risk, so there's something there potentially for your firm ground or hard ground boots. As well, there needs to be more research talking about wet conditions, because the turf shoe showed to have less performance and more slipperiness on wet turf than on dry, which could potentially talk more about, hey, slippery equals maybe less traction, maybe, more ankle load, right? The soft ground boots tended to be the worst in most conditions, besides very, very specific muddy, natural grass, slippery conditions, right? Most studies show that the soft ground shoes are just not going to be best suited for most conditions, just because of the impact, the ground reaction forces that are elicited through them, as well as just the slippery nature of them. They're not able to get really deep into a lot of conditions, especially turf fields. So watch out for that. I would stay away from soft ground unless it's specifically for muddy type conditions. This is not just for injury prevention. This is also for performance for soft ground boots. I mean, the studies that looked at performance metrics, the soft ground boots just weren't there in comparison to the other boots, specifically the firm ground or the hard ground. The third overall takeaway, and probably the most important one, is that the firm ground boots are probably the best bang for your buck here. They've been showing up constantly throughout not only performance metrics, but then also injury prevention in terms of both artificial grass and natural grass. They have good traction, which is not only good for performance metrics such as cutting or running, but also for the speed of the shot. There was one study that looked at cleats that had good traction on the support leg enhanced the speed of the shot. as well as in dribbling capacity and velocity. Firm ground boots were one of the best in that category, specifically the bladed studs over the rounded conical stud types, which does feed into a little controversy here talking about rounded versus bladed studs. It all kind of comes back to rounded versus bladed stud types, even in terms of the 5 different types of boots. Now, if this seems kind of interesting to you, this controversy between bladed and conical stud types, you should check out my last video where I talked in depth between this controversy of almost too much traction, which could potentially increase injury risk. So make sure you check out that video if you haven't already, especially if you're gonna go out and buy a new pair of cleats anytime soon. So yeah, that's just a brief overview of the vast literature that is out there in terms of different style of boots. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you have, make sure you're subscribed so you're watching around for a couple more of these style of videos. I have a couple more cooking up, getting ready. I'm excited about them. I hope you will be as well. With that being said, I will see you later. Goodbye.